Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to our educational update, approval voting in Maryland. My name is Nina Taylor. I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Election Science. And before we get into the presentation and question and answer segment, I wanted to review a few housekeeping rules. We are streaming live within our educational platform as well as YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. No matter where you are watching us from, we are absolutely thrilled to have you here with us. Today's presentation will kick off with introductions and move into a foundational presentation of our advocacy efforts in Maryland, and then open up for a bit of Q&A with our team. We will collect your questions along the way, so feel free to use the chat to ask questions of our presenters, and you'll see your questions woven into the discussion portion of the presentation. We expect to see very many questions for this presentation, and we will make every effort to get to as many as possible. If we cannot get to your questions, our participants have graciously agreed to answer additional questions after the presentation via email, and we'll post the responses in our Discord community. Whether this is your first time joining us or you are a long-term supporter of our work, we ask that you remain respectful of our presenters and each other on all platforms. While we have our differences in opinion, we would like to ensure that our educational environments and all engagements remain professional, open, and respectful of all participants. Any non-compliance of our code of conduct, you will find yourself removed from the chat. At the end of the presentation, you'd expect from us an evaluation. We would love to hear what you thought of the presentation and any ideas you may have for future web series. In this critical time in the reform community, I would like to ask that you continue to support our work. You can make a donation to the Center for Election Science on our website, electionscience.org/giving, and we encourage you to become a monthly donor. Thank you to everyone who supports our work in kind, in donation, and sharing our mission with your network. So let's get into the event. Many of you have tracked our progress in Maryland and might have noticed some incremental successes we've seen. CES has a solid advocacy group to open doors for us, and the lessons we are learning can serve as great stepping stones to bringing approval voting to your state. It's such a treat that I'm able to introduce you to our guest speakers today. First up, we have Brandon Butler, who started Pinnacle Strategies in June of 2021. Prior to launching his own firm, Mr. Butler was a registered lobbyist with a Annapolis, Maryland-based government relations firm, and Brandon most recently served as county administrator of Allegheny County, Maryland. Prior to that, he worked as a deputy assistant secretary for workforce development and adult learning at Maryland's Department of Labor, Licensing and Regulation. While there, Butler was the chief architect in crafting Maryland's first state workforce plan under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. He was also the chief of staff for the District 1 delegation, which includes Garrett, Allegheny, and Washington counties, for approximately 7 years. During that time, Butler obtained his JD from the University of Baltimore School of Law and has been a licensed attorney since 2013. And I'd also like to introduce to you Mary Cramer-Wagner, who joined Pinnacle Strategies in 2023 after a 21-year career at the State Board of Elections. While there, Mary served as the director of voter registration and served as one of the leads on the board's legislative initiatives. During her career, Mary is a staple in the halls of Annapolis, and I can certainly attest to this with legislators frequently confiding in Mary regarding elections matters. Mary continues to be the go-to for election issues with state and local elections administrators. Prior to her role with the State Board of Elections, Mary served as staff to the Washington County delegation in Annapolis. During the question and answer segment, Allison Sardinas will join us. Allison is CES's Director of Markets and Partnerships. She's a graduate of Florida International University, where she earned her master's degree in English literature. Prior to joining CES, Allison's civic engagements led her to grassroots advocacy and eventually a political director role for a congressional campaign. After finding her niche in political campaigns and advocacy, she went on to run federal and field campaigns for various political organizations. Full biographies of our panelists can be found on our website at electionscience.org. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our guest presenters.
Thank you, Nina, so very much. And thank you, Allison. My name is Brandon, and I am the owner of Pinnacle Strategies. We are very fortunate, on behalf of Mary and myself, we are very fortunate to be a part of CES's team. As Nina mentioned, I guess I hold two dirty L words, lobbyist and lawyer. And so, I think that is something that, let's get it out of the way here. You may have heard about a lobbyist. You may have heard bad things about a lobbyist. You may have associated them with backroom deals or, those types of things. I think of a lobbyist as a part of the team trying to pull your message forward and get your message across, whether that's through legislative efforts, whether that's through other government action or sometimes inaction. And so what we're trying to do today is to tell the story about Maryland and what we've been able to do on behalf of CES's team. And so we're very fortunate to be a part of that team. I like to say that lobbyists are Sherpas through the legislative process. If you want to play around with that, feel free. But we have really been fortunate over the last now combined 40 years of experience in and around the legislative process. So, I wouldn't be a good lawyer if I didn't say this. There is a disclaimer, and the opinions that we have, and we do have a lot of them, that we are shared today are honed based on that legislative experience. And so they are not necessarily those held by the Center for Election Science and staff, its wonderful staff, I should have put that, or its board of directors. And so let's get into it. Next slide, please. That's who we are. You can read that, of course, in our bios. It seems like we're playing a game show here of all of the different different backgrounds everybody comes from. Let's hit the next slide. We'll talk about today's agenda. We're going to talk about the uniqueness of state legislatures, and they are unique. Some are full-time, some are part-time, some have big staffs, some have small staffs. We'll talk a little bit more about then major issues and major influences on those issues, and then building consensus. What does that look like in the legislative sense? And finally, we'll focus on Maryland and some key takeaways, as Nina mentioned. If you're looking at this democratic process about engaging your legislator or engaging your legislature, then how do you do that? And so we'll end up with key takeaways and then some hopefully some questions and answers. All right, so we all know the quote, and if you were a big West Wing fan, you would have heard Leo McGarry say this at some point, that laws are like sausages. It is better not to see them being made. Maybe not. I think the legislative process is very unique and is very, very interesting to watch during Maryland, our 90-day session. Other states go year round. And so seeing those laws being made, it's if I want to get a song stuck in your head, the old Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill, and that bill just doesn't go poof out of thin air and all of a sudden ends up on the chief elected official's desk. But it takes a process. And so let's go to that next slide, and we'll first talk about the uniqueness of state legislatures. And of course, Justice Louis Brandeis was famous for this quote, calling states the laboratories where a single courageous state or others may come and try a unique intervention, try a unique opportunity to move the needle forward. And so for other state legislatures and states to latch onto. And next slide. So a view of the Laboratories of Democracy. And I'm going to kick it over to Mary so that she can walk us through this slide. Mary?
I thank you, Brandon, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to follow up on Brandon's disclosure statement. I have worked with the Maryland General Assembly in several capacities for 26 years. So my expertise is with the Maryland General Assembly, with limited knowledge to other states' legislative processes. But Brandon and I also have very many contacts outside of the state. As Brandon pointed out, each state is different and varies. You've got a range of legislatures that meet for 30 days every other year. You have 9 states that have a full-time legislature, which, can you imagine the resources that those legislators have? Maryland is a part-time legislature, and we meet for 90 days, consecutive days, starting in January, ending in April. And I bring that up with the resources because that is key. Maryland legislators have very limited resources, and we will pick up on that later because that is instrumental in cultivating your relationships within the legislature. So what happens when you introduce a bill? I'm going to go back to 2024 legislative session. There were 3,480 bills introduced. Of those bills introduced, 1,049 passed into law. So within that 90 days, that's a lot of sausage that you have to go through, as Brandon said. And again, we're going back to resources. So how do these legislators get their information? You've got a sponsor, which for Senate Bill 913, which gave municipalities the authority to conduct their elections through approval voting. So you've got a sponsor of legislation that believes in that. Obviously, very key. Has to have buy-in from the legislator. So where do you go from there? Okay, you think, who's impacted by the passage of this legislation? Municipalities. So you reach out to the municipalities, the clerks of elections in each municipality, just like legislatures nationwide, very different. But you reach out to those to make sure that this is something that they can implement. Then you go to the local boards of elections. In Maryland, we have 24 county boards of elections. And there's an association, the Maryland Association of Election Officials. We approach them. Is this something that you all can implement that will be easy for you all from an administrative standpoint? So we've already checked 3 boxes: sponsorship of the bill, the local, the municipal level, the county level. Then we go to the state board of elections to say, how do you feel about this bill? And got buy-in from there. The next key issue that I want to make clear is, again, we're going back to resources, going to the council, the committee council. And why is that important? So in Maryland, we have a committee in the Senate and a committee in the House that listens to election-related bills. Went to council to make sure that, A, they knew that the bill was going to be introduced and get a hearing, and what the bill entailed. Do they have any questions? Do they have any, do they see any legal challenges that could come up? You never want to get blindsided. I would never, when Nina and her team came to testify, I don't want them having, a barrage of questions being thrown at them that we don't even know that's coming to the table. Another key factor would be your advocacy groups. In Maryland, we are very, very lucky to have a forward-thinking, pro-voting, reform advocacy groups. We have the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, ACLU. Bring them all to the table. How do you feel about this? And that is what you want to do, is you are building a coalition to make sure that everybody is on the same page and you're good with it. So I could talk about elections and I could talk about the Maryland General Assembly all day, but I have a feeling, Brandon's going to give me the hook. So
No, that's fine. And that's the really interesting thing, is that there are legislatures treat bills differently, and there's different paths towards that that passage of that bill. For instance, in the state of West Virginia, there was a few years ago, Mary had rattled off the number of bills that passed in Maryland versus those that were presented, about 30% or so, and that's about the going rate. In West Virginia, a few years ago, the rate was 10% passage. So 9 out of 10 bills didn't see the light of day, whether that was thrown into a council or a drawer of a committee, or whether that was an up and down no vote. So that's one of those things that each legislature is a little different, both in that time. California, Pennsylvania, full-time legislature, whereas in Maryland, we are in that 90-day window. Next slide, please. So major issues take time, and I think this is a really important point. Is that, again, back to that Schoolhouse Rock song, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill, will get, shoved through the committee system and out again, and bada bing, bada boom, you're done. That's not always the case, and it's most often isn't the case, particularly when it comes to major issues. In Maryland, for instance, cannabis legislation is, as well as some of you may know, in other states, where states are truly a laboratory for reform in cannabis. But in Maryland, it has taken several years, both on the medical side and now on the recreation side, to even consider getting those markets stood up. Same thing with gaming in Maryland. Both table gaming and slot machines are a constitutional amendment. So the legislature had to pass a bill, but it was later the people of the state of Maryland voted to have table gaming and slot machines put into Maryland in some things, for more expenditures to education. We also have a large educational reform bill that is called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. It's a very massive bill that started off as a task force that had some of Maryland's best and brightest on it, including a former chancellor of the University of Maryland system. But that was a bill that is now requiring billions of dollars to go into things like better teacher pay and other reforms, getting students more college and career ready. But those bills all took at least 3 years. We like to say that there's this unwritten rule of 3 in Maryland, where major initiatives generally take 3 years, maybe sometimes earlier, sometimes later. But in these instances, cannabis, gaming, education reform, other pieces of legislation that take years and years of socialization, of going through that process of getting it right, sometimes maybe running out of time, sometimes finding out that the major reform that you thought had a broad support really doesn't. And so that's where that 90-day session and then the work after the 90-day session really takes hold. Next slide. Because not only do major issues take time, there are sometimes outside forces that may speed up or slow down reforms. And Mary, you have an example with COVID in mail-in ballots.
Yes, thank you, Brandon. Certainly. So, like every state in 2020, you've got a presidential election. You don't have poll workers. You don't have polling places. You don't know how are we going to run this election. And so, working with the governor's office, we did come up with a solution of him signing a proclamation to allow mail-in ballots being sent to all registered voters in Maryland. This is great. It was like, shoo. But there were other things that behind the scenes that had to take place. People were not feeling really comfortable about the U.S. Postal Service at that time. And so we developed drop boxes, those drop boxes that are still in use today. And where individuals, they already had a postage paid, prepaid ballot, but where they had another goal, they had another avenue that they could take. So what happens after the election? Oh, it just lit up. Everybody wanted mail-in. I always want my mail-in ballots. And then the legislature saying, nope, slow your roll, Skippy. We like our polling places. We like early vote. No. We don't want mail-in ballots. So what do? You educate and you form a consensus with the legislature. And we had to do it in pretty fast time because we only have 2 years between elections, and it takes us 18 months to ramp up for an election. So we had to build that consensus and bring everybody to the table, educate, and we came up with permanent mail-in ballots. And the legislature swallowed hard, but passed it. And it does come with a lot of education, a lot of notification and whatnot. But that is what it takes: consensus, education, and working together.
And Mary, that's a really good point, because that was your work whenever you were at the State Board of Elections and able to work through that. And everybody was talking during COVID about what's the next thing. What are the I remember the you got to stand 6 feet apart. You've got the arrows going up and down the grocery aisles. And so this was a reform that really was supercharged because of the global pandemic. But there are other reforms that often are slowed down because of budget constraints and fiscal hardships. In Maryland, as in many states, we're looking at a budget deficit this year. And so what happens then is that any major initiative that is put forward also comes with it a note from the Department of Legislative Services, a nonpartisan department that works for and with the legislature, so that there is a policy and fiscal note that is provided to each bill. As Mary said, those are often written by folks with the council staff will end up writing some of these. Sometimes they are farmed out to ask for opinions at the local level. So this is where those policy and fiscal notes that are attached to the bill are often critical in budget constrained in fiscal hardship environments. Next slide, please. So, where football season is among us, it all starts with a good game. As Mary said, educate is so vitally important. In Maryland, we had ranked choice voting was already had some bills in the legislature. They already had pushed forward those reforms as a potential option. They had supporters in particularly populous Montgomery County. And so a lot of the conversations that we had this year focused on that education piece about how ranked choice and other reforms like approval voting is different. So we can, rather than being placed in the same bucket as ranked choice, then let's define ourselves as to what approval voting is and what it isn't. And so some of that did require a lot of education, a lot of outreach. As Mary said, we started our ground game very, very early on with going to the local elections officials and talking to them about approval voting, and talking to them about how this can integrate with the current voting system and not require all of the extra hoops, or maybe a new voting system in and of itself. And so having those conversations and alleviating some of the concerns early on, because they were going to be the folks that got got those fiscal note questionnaires. And so a lot of that information exchange early on at the local level allowed us then to build that solid foundation, then to build a coalition. Mary, you've been working very hard on a number of coalitions during the interim here that are really important to note.
Yes, Brandon, we've been reaching out and having dialogues with the ACLU, Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, as well as several legislators. Interestingly, we are working with legislators who had less than desired results in the primary election, shall we say. And again, working with local municipal clerks and whatnot. So
Yeah.
it's, again, all about building a coalition, also making sure that the bill, once again, is introduced as enthusiastically as it was last year. So
Yeah, and that's also, I think that's also a very good point, given CES's reputation and experiences in other communities, such as St. Louis and Fargo and others, where that coalition building on the ballot initiative side of things is also vitally important. And so that's where I think that democratic process of putting forward a legislation, working with your legislature, is very much similar to that coalition building that you'll need to have in ballot initiative states. Next slide. Maryland in focus. So we talked a lot about this before. We put in a bill in the Senate. This we had as Mary said, a very enthusiastic sponsor in Senator Mike McKay. Senator McKay is a Republican from Western Maryland. He's my senator, and he is a sponsor that has the ability to reach across the aisle. I know that seems like a foreign concept these days, and where Republicans and Democrats don't often see common ground. But finding a legislator that can be that champion, I think, is very important. And there's, as Mary had mentioned in the past, about finding that champion. In Maryland, and I'm sure in other states, there are some legislators that like to kind of gravitate around certain issues. For instance, there is a Prince George's County senator that, if you want to talk about apprenticeships, he'll talk your ear off. He's focused on building apprenticeships in Maryland. In the House, there was a delegate, Delegate John Cardin, who was always so attuned on election bills and putting forward election bills. You'd often want to go to Delegate Cardin for his advice on bills. And so picking the right sponsor, I think, is almost as critical sometimes as the text itself, because it is about relationships. and it is about building those relationships, not having as some folks say in Annapolis, a sponsor problem, where somebody may not see eye to eye with certain people, maybe rub people the wrong way, and so finding those sponsors and those champions, I think, is critically important. Also, meeting with election officials, we can't underscore that point enough, and advocacy groups to build that grassroots coalition up, as well as separating ourselves from ranked choice. And that leads to that educate. There was a bill also from the Montgomery County delegation this legislative session that was put in many times before about ranked choice and approval voting. So we were able to say, hey, let's talk about that approval voting side of this bill. And then, of course, be present. And I think that is so vitally important. And that is why, admittedly, government relations individuals like Mary and I, lobbyists, are so critically important to supercharge your efforts, whether that's approval voting or whether that's any other issue that you may have. Next slide, please. And there we go. We have Nina and Allison and Chris and others from the CES team proudly showing the bill with the State House dome in the back. We're very partial in Maryland because that building is actually the same place that George Washington had resigned his commission of the Continental Army. So we get to walk the same halls as George Washington. That's pretty cool. And then you see Nina and Chris, all smiles there, with outside of the Education, Energy, and Environment Committee, just fresh off of testifying on behalf of our bill. I think that's also another good plug to say about the democratic process that is the legislative process in Maryland and in other states. So many times we hear my vote doesn't matter, or my voice doesn't count. Well, here is a point where you can reach out to your legislators in that 90-day session or in that year-round session, and immediately get feedback from them about the bills that you're concerned about. There were many times in Maryland also went to a process where where testimony can be solicited virtually in a forum just like this. And so committee staff can call on Marylanders throughout the state. They don't have to travel all the way to Annapolis. Speaking of Annapolis, Maryland had a former governor, Governor Larry Hogan, very popular man. He's running for the U.S. Senate now. And so our job as advocates is not constrained to that 90-day session. As a matter of fact, a lot of the work of building those coalitions, building a foundation, is so critically important after the 90-day session. And so CES was able to exhibit at the Maryland Association of Counties, and Governor Hogan, who has been very vocal about both parties coming to a consensus, was able to try approval voting there on the screen, the touch screen, and see how approval voting can form those consensus and where the two parties can come together. Next slide. So we're coming towards the end of our presentation. And so there were some key takeaways. If you're not from Maryland, that's okay. Here's some key takeaways that you can implement, whether, again, approval voting or any other initiative that you might have. First of all, an idea is just an idea until it's on paper. So drafting a bill brings people to the table. And so having those conversations with oh, by the way, this bill was pre-filed by Senator McKay, or, oh, by the way, our bill just received a hearing date. Those are the things that make this tangible, instead of just a reform that you might have, or a conversation in a chat room on Reddit. Here is an actual application of this is what approval voting could mean in Maryland. The other is establishing yourself as a trusted source of information. Mary, I think you and I have talked about this a lot, about having our not only having us, but also having Nina and Allison coming to the table as trusted sources of information.
Absolutely, Brandon. And that is key. And it does go back to, again, the limited resources that Maryland's legislature has. The legislatives, they want to make sure that they get all the information that they can. Who is that trusted source I'm going to go to? And I'm proud that Brandon and I are part of that trusted source pot that they will go to get the answers that they need.
But it's also, I think it's also important that we brought Nina to the table, we brought Allison to the table, so that they were able to testify not only on our bill specifically, but we also CES took a position in defense of election officials this year. I think that was also critically important to point out that, hey, we are about the process here. We are an innovation, but we are about the process of ensuring that Maryland's ballots have the integrity that the voters deserve. And so having, having Nina at the table, having Allison and others at the table, I think was also very, very critical in making sure that as we put forward this new initiative on approval voting, at least in Maryland, that we had folks who understand the ins and outs of approval voting sitting there with us, not just listening to Mary or I.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, Brandon, and they were so key, because I would say, okay, again, this 90 days goes fast and furious. And I would say, okay, I've got all these meetings with these legislators. Can you come in? And they were there. We'll be there. We'll be there. We'll be there. And that was huge. That was huge, because Brandon and I can talk all day about approval voting, and we do, because we believe in it. But again, the trusted source of information, CES, being there.
Absolutely. And I think also having the QR code. And so during the hearing, we were able to put the QR code so that legislators could take their phones out, snap a picture or snap that QR code, and immediately be able to go to an approval voting site so that they could see for themselves what this could look like. I think, again, not just talking about an idea, but literally touching, seeing how this could work. Also, legislative success is built on relationship. And I think that also goes to the point of these next two points. Work with those who ultimately implement the legislation now. As Nina pointed out, I used to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Labor. And I was thrilled, let me tell you, about finding a piece of legislation where I had 7 reports to write at the end of it. And so having to work with those who ultimately implement the legislation, I think, is key, as well as do not discount the staff or committee council. They're there to they can be your best friend, or sometimes they can be the gatekeeper, and having conversations with staff, because when you leave, the legislator is going to look at them and go, hey, what do you think about that? And so I think that is also a very, very important key takeaway. All right, so next slide, I think, is just our pictures. There's Mary. She's got a fantastic headshot. Me, not so much. But that's our emails too. And so I'm going to kick it over to our friend Allison. I see some comments here in the chat.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for kind of joining us, and please get those questions into the chat. We'll definitely be weaving them into the discussion. So now we're going to get into like our fireside chat moment. I think CES, it was like immediately baptism by fire, and it's like, we're going to take you to the state house, we're going to go testify. We have to meet all these people really quickly. But in that relationship building piece, you really can see how critical it is, not only for educational purposes, but really to build that kind of ally in that coalition. And so since we've got folks calling in from all over, I think my first question is, what steps can someone take to identify the right people in their community to talk to about approval voting?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think you said the key word there, right people, because nothing also sours a potential relationship than the wrong person at the table. And so having, take a beat, take a second and really plot this out. Who are your champions? Who are the people that you can rely on? Who are your I had a friend who used to refer to them as foxhole buddies. Who are the ones that are going to be in the trenches with you and have your back whenever it matters the most. I think that the best advice is take a breath, take a beat, and really be strategic.
And I think I want to add for some of our advocates here, because we have a question that we got from YouTube. Sorry, I know like sometimes it just says first last for some reason, but that's because it comes from YouTube. The question here is like, what recommendations do the presenters have for building a coalition? So that answers the sponsor question. But I just wanted to say, if you're like a regular person who's just really engaged in this work and is interested in getting involved and finds that you're either in a state that does not do ballot initiatives, because as we noted in the chat, just less than half of states have that ballot initiative process. And it's a democratic option, but it's also kind of cumbersome. It takes a lot of money, a lot of signatures, a lot of volunteer hours, right? It's not like this easy process that you can just walk into either. A really good place to start for folks is some of these grassroots and grass tops organizations that have national networks that will always be helpful for you. Brandon and Mary mentioned the League of Women Voters, for example. They always have relationships with the legislatures in their state. The ACLU, those kinds of orgs that tend to be a little bit more pro-democracy, those people will have relationships. So if you don't have them yet, that's a good place to start. A lot of these are also membership orgs, so you can also be involved in those organizations. And, you can have lots of different strategies to engage while also looking at just like the sponsorships and the legislatures, because that grass tops part is really integral in making sure that your legislation or your desired legislation has some legs, that it seems legitimate.
Yeah. And I just want to underscore that, at least in a lot of our conversations, sometimes we're introducing approval voting for the very first time, right? So there is this educational moment that needs to happen, whether through the QR code where they're actually trying it for themselves, or leveraging our advocacy tools that's on the website. But there is that first hurdle, right? It's like, what is approval voting? And then we get into the other pieces. So Mary Brady, can you speak to how we're framing approval voting to appeal to legislators across party lines, given Maryland's political dynamics?
Mary, I'm going to let you handle that one first. I've talked way too much.
Well,
she's
I'm
rolling
trying to
her eyes
process.
right now. I see how this is.
Yeah. I'm trying to process. It's a great question, and it's an ongoing process, is all I can say. I wish I could say, oh, here's the document, clear cut and whatnot. I'm learning. I know about approval voting. I think it's a fabulous voting reform, but I'm also learning as we're getting in, and thanks to CES, who gathers phenomenal data, statistics on, and you know, I'm being very selfish. I'll be like, can you look at this race in Maryland? Can you look at this race in Maryland and let me know? Again, there's a individual who everybody was very surprised that they lost in the primary. I mean, we all just kind of went, what? And we know that that individual is very eager to talk to us about approval voting and advancing. So, you know, again, it's just a learning process, especially when it hits close to home for these candidates.
Right. And so there's a couple things that we've emphasized with talking with legislators. First of all, ease of implementation, where we've got to look at it as this is not a cost. There's an education cost, but this is not a cost that is going to be borne on the legislature for a new voting system. And I think that is where we can myth bust some other reforms that's going to require a change in the voting system. So that's one of the things. First, ease of implementation. Secondly, transparency. You know, transparency is a buzzword, but this is something that we truly mean whenever we're. So, you know, hey, you get to vote for people that you approve of, and so you get to change that number from the, you know, splitting that, you know, taking three people now splitting a third, and a third, and then all of a sudden claiming that that person has a mandate. And so here is an opportunity to be transparent with the voter and saying, hey, check the boxes of the people that you approve of. That would be a good, or that would be a good dog catcher, would be a good person in that office. And so let's take that, rather than throwing your ballot in a magic black box, it's shaking it up and then spitting out results. This is an opportunity to say, this is transparent, this is ease of implementation, and this is a right innovation that we believe for Maryland.
Awesome.
And Brandon, to the transparency part, that is our reality. I mean, if we're not transparent, especially in the elections community, then you've got nothing. So it's a real. You have to be transparent.
Yep, absolutely.
Another question here. It also looks like it's like a major key alert. Do we have buy-in from anyone in Speaker Jones's office? Election legislation won't go anywhere without her.
A great point. And the speaker, you know, is a very, you know, she is a very influential individual whenever it comes to Maryland, particularly in Maryland politics. You know, and she does handle the, she does hold that office very, very well. We are also working very closely with the Ways and Means Committee on the on particularly as the committee of subject matter jurisdiction, and so that's the conversations Mary was alluding to previously as well, about finding the right people to also bring a little street cred to our initiative.
Yeah, awesome. And I have another question here from one of our board members, and it's something that we talk about quite a bit. And so, you know, for those of us that love CES support approval voting, by how long can we expect to kind of move this needle down for approval voting to be implemented in Maryland? So, like, what is that timeline reasonably? And like, is there something else you can measure it against? I know you had mentioned cannabis, but given all of the traction that we have, what's possible to get approval voting from nowhere to somewhere implemented in Maryland?
Yep, great question. And I'm going to give the lawyer answer. It depends, right? So I think it does require a lot of effort, and I think we've done that during the interim. and looking forward to seeing the fruits of that during this upcoming legislative session, which is just around the corner. Believe it or not, January will be here sooner than later. And so I think having gone from we just introduced the concept last year to having taken that first step of putting the thoughts on paper, then now taking it to, we've spent that from April until today, socializing that with, again, with legislators, with coalition. And so and also the last person's comment, looking at having a House version of the bill as well implemented this year, and introduced this year. So I think we're making those strides of connecting with legislators, connecting with coalitions, connecting with the House of Delegates in a way that I think is very, that can move the needle forward. Recognizing too, budget processes and budget items, I'm not going to say that's going to take a very, very big chunk of the legislature this year. Maryland has two very important constitutional requirements. One, the only bill that gets there that needs to get passed in a 90-day session is one bill. It's called the budget, and legislators don't get to go home until the budget's passed. The other one is that Maryland is required to have a balanced budget. So every 90-day session, we don't get to carry things over until, in continuing resolutions or anything like that. So I think that is going to be the telltale of how big of an elephant is the budget going to be this year about any piece of legislation.
Mm-hmm. And I would just like to add, and I don't want to hold up anybody, but if COVID taught us nothing, knock on wood, we don't go through another, pandemic. But when I see what happened in 2020 to every legislative initiative, it just blew up. I mean, nothing got passed. I don't want to give any false hope. I feel good about it. But like Brandon, I don't want to put a timestamp on it.
Yeah. And I think to Justine's point, there are benchmarks though that you can kind of look for to note that we are making progress, that we should be doing things in a timeline that makes sense. That's anywhere from like a reasonable timeline is 3-5 years. And I think that's mostly because there are things that are completely outside of our control. For example, the bridge collapsed last year, right? What are you going to do about that? Then all of a sudden your legislative priority sort of rightly is taken off the table, and so that we can ameliorate this problem that no one foresaw. But there are benchmarks. One of them is an increasing amount of sponsors on your legislation, being able to have legislation introduced in both the House and then the Senate. There are indicators like having an increased number of local boards willing to testify on your behalf. There are these kinds of things that indicate that you're picking up support, that it's moving. And so it's not that you can't say, oh, concretely, we are advancing this in a way that we're comfortable saying, yes, we are making progress. But to Brandon and Mary's point, there are lots of things, like even though it's your priority, it's not everyone's priority. And there are things like budgets, which, by the way, Maryland, part of the reason we're sort of harping on that is because Maryland's going through some budget cuts across the state, right? And this dictates a lot of people's priorities. And while we do have a pretty fiscally, I would say efficient, we'll call it that, a reform it shouldn't cost very much money at all, it still is going to raise some red flags. And so for people who are wary of new reforms costing money, our job is to ensure that as soon as the conditions are right, it gets passed. Yep. And so that's what we're doing. As soon as the conditions are right, it should be passed. And sometimes things happen outside of our control, but we are making progress on all of those kind of measurable fronts.
Awesome.
And I think one of those wins too was last year was when that bill, we had the hearing, and the bill wasn't voted down. I know that sounds really awkward, but it was a bill that that the committee was engaged in, that and I think that was a signal to that the committee was anxious to think about this moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, and that's interesting because, like, it ended in a no vote, which strategically was awesome positioning for us, right? But if you looked it up, it was like, people might have thought that, oh, that bill got killed. And it's like, no, right? Like, we're in really solid footing. And so to that point, one of the other things that I've heard, especially this week, is that approval voting hasn't been legally challenged, right? And so kind of like having that as some sort of litmus test. What legal obstacles, if any, could prevent the adoption of approval voting in Maryland? And how would you suggest not only the CES, but the broader community navigate those?
So Brandon, I'm gonna go back to when I approached Ways and Means Committee Council with the bill. That was one of my questions is, okay, here's the bill. This is what it does. Do you see any legal challenges? Because again, you want to take that off the table. If they come and I've got some opposition that's going to come in and say, oh, it's not, constitutional. It's not this, it's not that, you can't do it. I wanted to know ahead of time. So I don't see, but again, Brandon's the legal eagle of the team here. I don't see any legal challenges.
Yeah, and I think that's also a very important part is that there's the process of having, we've looked at it, we have formed it very similar to other pieces of legislation that started down this path. We also wanted to look at ways that when a bill gets passed, it takes a stop at the Attorney General's office before it makes its way to the governor's office as well for legal sufficiency. So I think that is also another point where, because you don't want to get all the way through the process and then get this nice little notification that says, hey, this might not be constitutional. I think the point to Nina's point as well is we have the practical thing in our corner of there's not a voting system that has to be procured that checks the box for approval voting. Approval voting can be implemented now. And so when it comes to things like the budget, when it comes to things like procurement, these are things that we can separate that other reforms truthfully can't say.
And I just want to add, because we have like a minute here, this does speak to one of the efficacies of a legislative route. It is a little bit more legally robust. If you get the legislature involved, those are the people who are more likely to sue you if you do a ballot initiative. So if they're the ones who pass it, they are less likely to sue you and less likely to ensure or like rip apart your ballot initiative. You see this happening all throughout the country where legislatures try to weaken ballot initiatives. But if it's going through the legislature, that's much less likely to happen. So it's a little less costly and a little less risky in that regard. It's one of the benefits.
And I guess, because I'm going to squeeze in just a couple more questions in this. So with attacks to the reform like we've seen in Missouri, is legislation a safer route for implementation? Or does it run the same risk as a ballot initiative?
I mean, everything has a risk, right? So whether that is I always think ballot initiatives are sometimes very, very risky in the fact that, okay, I just collected all my signatures here. I got them. And then it goes through the process of, okay, maybe that one doesn't work, or that one isn't, we didn't collect that one correctly. Maryland is not a ballot initiative state, but we do have some experience in the referendum side, bringing things to referendum And, Mary, you've seen it as in your 21 years with the State Board of Elections, where election or referendum processes and whether this one counts, this one doesn't. I don't know. I mean, I think that one's just fraught with danger.
And it really is. I mean, that was one of the hats that I wore. I was the director of the petitions division. And I would work very closely with the sponsors of these petitions and say, this is the number you need. Now go out and gather 30% more because
they're going to get rejected, right? Like
you're
you
going to
just
get
know.
rejected because you go up to somebody out on the street. And again, my heart, I'd work very closely. These people have my home phone number. And, if I walk up to you and say, hi, miss, would you sign my petition? Are you a registered voter? There's not a person alive that's not going to say I'm not a registered voter.
Right.
And they're not.
Right.
So,
Right.
Yeah. And, one of the things that we get to do that ballot initiative processes don't necessarily, when you're building a coalition around a ballot initiative, you do ideally want to get buy-in from the legislature, from election officials, et cetera, et cetera. However, through the legislative process, that is much smoother. It's almost built in. We are able to much more easily educate election officials. We can get the buy-in of the legislature, and we can also solicit the opinions and comments from the regular public, right? We have testimonies, we have abilities, and we've pushed out we did. So hopefully we'll see you guys next session, and you can write some opinions that, or rather written testimony in support, because there's a lot of opportunities through the legislative process to ensure everyone is able to be engaged. And we're going to try to, as we move forward, make that really accessible for activists. And if you all are interested in ways to do a more legislative approach, we're always around and happy to answer those questions, because vote splitting is a problem everywhere. And even though we've seen that there are there's doubts in the chat about if party bosses or if the parties would be interested, we saw a question about deep red states. I would like to note that our bill sponsor in Maryland is a Republican. We are really trying our hardest to make this a truly bipartisan initiative. We do not want people to understand this is benefiting one party or another, or really parties in general. We want it to just reflect what the voters want and the will of the voters, and finding consensus. And you might be surprised. There are definitely legislators, even though it's been rough for a lot of people, but there are definitely legislators that are interested in talking to you about this and are much more open to it than you might think.
For sure. I'm going to squeeze in one more question from Michael. How RCV and approval voting interact in moving forward? Are both being legitimized by the legislation?
So that's one of those things, one of those conversations that we had in the interim a few months ago, where Mary and I sat down with a gentleman from the Cato Institute who was a big RCV fan, and in those 2.5 hours, I think, that we spent with him, it was more about finding the common ground as an innovation. And I think that is where RCV and approval voting can interact. I mean, we can be the Jets and the Sharks if we'd like, and we could throw our parties and you can throw yours, or we can find that middle ground on, okay, what can we do together, as in recognition that sometimes systems are broken. And so how can we better influence and better get to an outcome that voters feel comfortable with, that voters feel as if their voice is heard? And so that's where I think the two can interact together. There are bills that both that mention both. I mentioned the Montgomery County piece of legislation. It was a local bill that has both RCV and approval voting. Sometimes that meant that one took the spotlight in front of the other. But I think what this does is it shines the light on, hey guys, we got to do something. You know, if we're as in an elections environment where people go, I'd rather not vote, or and then you have legislators or officials that say, hey, I just won 30% of the vote. I have a mandate, and I'm going to do everything I want because I have a mandate. That's not what any of us believe an election system should be. And so there's an opportunity that RCV and approval voting can interact together.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone in the chat for all of your questions. Thank you to the Maryland Dream Team for sharing your expertise with us all. I just want to highlight for everyone that as we're doing more virtual events, we'd love to get your feedback. Please use this QR code and take the survey about today. And if you have any ideas for future sessions, we'd love to hear them. And so really, because this work is ongoing, we're still working on Maryland now. We are gearing up to draft, do our pre-bill drafting for the fall, and starting to kind of advocate to get ready for January. And so as we learn more about this process, we'll definitely organize playbooks for everyone. And if you have questions about how this might work for your state, please feel free to reach out to us here at the Center for Election Science. Brandon, Mary, Allison, always been a pleasure. And I know this is really heavy stuff and very serious, but we laugh a lot as a group. Like to let it be known, this is a team of goofballs and we love it. We have humor in all of what we do. So thank you all, and thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
Bye.